Hi everyone, my name is Gregory and I'm an indie game developer and a music composer. In this video, I'd like to share with you some ideas about creating a deep connection between music and game design. I've been interested in those kinds of ideas for several years now, and I incorporated them in two puzzle games I had the privilege of composing music for. The first one is Taiji, an open-world puzzle adventure game similar to The Witness. And the other is a line-drawing puzzle game called Trifoil. It's still in development, but the demo is now available on Steam. Aside from Taiji and Trifoil, I'll also talk about related ideas in games I did not work on, such as Braid, Patrick's Parabox, Cyberpunk 2077, Mini Metro, Celeste, and several other games. This video is meant to be useful for game designers and composers alike. You don't need a musical background to follow along. Occasionally I'll use some slightly advanced music terms, but they will be explained in a yellow rectangle like this one. Various approaches can be taken when choosing instruments for a video game music and deciding how the instrumentation changes throughout the game. The world structure in both Taiji and Trifoil is built around separating and combining distinct puzzle mechanics. So I decided to musically reinforce the structure in the player's mind by assigning specific musical instruments to specific mechanics. Each puzzle mechanic in Trifoil is represented by a distinct musical instrument. This area uses only the twist symbol mechanic, so the only instrument that plays, aside from the background pads, is piano. This other area combines two mechanics, bridges and free-floating symbols. Therefore, the music combines their corresponding instruments, electric guitar and cello. I chose instruments that sound very different from each other to highlight the uniqueness of each mechanic. If the game contained two mechanics that are similar to each other, or two variants of the same mechanic, it would make sense to assign to them similar sounding instruments, for example, trumpet and saxophone. One way to classify instruments is by grouping them into sustained and non-sustained. Sustained instruments, like the cello, can hold a note at the same volume for many seconds. However, when you play a note on a non-sustained instrument, like the electric guitar, the peak volume of a note is right when you play it, and after that the volume constantly decays. This makes sustained and non-sustained instruments feel different. The mechanics in Trifoil can be grouped into symbols and metamechanics. All symbol mechanics are tied to non-sustained instruments, while all metamechanics are tied to sustained instruments. Sustained instruments feel more prolonged and ambient, and non-sustained ones feel more in the moment, which makes the former more appropriate for the metamechanics and the latter for the symbols. In Taiji, in most cases, multiple instruments represent a single mechanic instead of just one. Before I explain why that is, I have to warn you that the rest of this video contains major spoilers for Taiji. So I'd recommend you to play the game first. I promise it's absolutely worth your time. So the game shares its name with an ancient Chinese philosophy focused on dualism. In Taiji philosophy, the term Taiji refers to the balance and unity of opposing forces, like chaos and order, dark and light, and so on. Dualistic motifs appear consistently throughout the game's design, visuals, and music. To capture the dualism in the music, We used 2 melodic instruments in the pieces for most of the major areas in the game. One instrument plays regular, orderly melodies, and the other chaotic, out-of-the-blue melodies. This is the Gardens area, in which clarinet plays orderly melodies and harp plays chaotic melodies. While emphasizing these conceptual ideas was important, this had to be balanced with the initial impression to a first-time listener, so in some areas we added a third melodic instrument to enhance the mood and make the music more interesting. Each instrument is used in only one major area. Because of that, all major areas have a distinct sound, which feels good because all of them explore a different mechanic. In the game there are several optional areas, which mix mechanics from the 4 main symbol areas. Now I'm in the area which combines mine and shrine symbols. Therefore the music combines instruments from mine and shrine. To achieve that, I created a special music piece which is a mashup of shrine, mill, gardens and mine pieces. I just cut out the melodies from those 4 pieces and reshuffled them to sound decent together in all possible combinations. Instruments associated with each area were rendered into separate audio files. In the game, we play only the audio files tied to the currently used mechanics. In the Windows version of the game, hold Shift and press the right bracket twice to turn on the music debug view, in which you can see which layers are currently playing. Since this area mixes mine and shrine mechanics, both mix-in mine and mix-in shrine layers are playing. The meter in the middle shows the volume factor. When the volume factor is 1, the layer is played at full volume. When it's 0, the layer is muted. The left meter shows you the actual current loudness of a layer. Even if the volume factor is high, but the currently played part of the audio file is silent, the left meter will show you that the layer is currently silent. If a loud part of the audio file is currently played, but the volume factor is 0, which would make the layer silent, the left meter will also show that the layer is currently silent. The world is divided into many music zones. These are the ones in the orchard area. Each of those zones is configured by a text file. I uploaded all of the text files to GitHub. You can find the link to the GitHub repository in the description. Now I'll walk through several music zones so you can see how the music layers change. When a layer has a grayed out bar, it means it's not part of the current music zone, and therefore it is fading out. When its volume factor reaches 0, it disappears from the debug view. If you want to learn more about Taiji's dynamic music system, there is a link to a devlog video about it in the description. Now I am in the bonus area, where puzzles combine symbols from 3 or even 4 different areas. Each of those 4 puzzles uses a different set of symbols, so each has its own small music zone. In the Taiji mashup piece, we reused the melodies from the referenced areas instead of writing new ones. We mostly did that to save time. However, another advantage of that is that those melodies are already familiar to the player, so they evoke their memory of a given area and mechanic more strongly. So this extends the instrument equals mechanic idea into the instrument plus specific melodies equals mechanic. Taiji also tries to trigger the player's memory of specific areas and their mechanics through visuals. For instance, the small optional areas that use the mine mechanic feature the same visual themes as the mine area. Although in Taiji the visuals don't do this as meticulously as the music. Matthew composed most of the music for the gallery area, so he will tell you more about it.
Hey everybody, I'm Matthew Van Devender, and I'm the designer of Taiji, and I also contributed to the soundtrack. So the main concept for the gallery is to have what appears to be art pieces, which also conceal clues to puzzles. So outside of that, there's not really an overarching mechanical theme for the area. There are one-off puzzle ideas there, but there's also several threads that carry on for multiple puzzles. So it's kind of a bit easier to think of the gallery as like being a collection of ideas that weren't quite big enough to form their own areas, but nonetheless, they're grouped together into sort of this meta structure of an area, right? This does make the area somewhat mechanically inconsistent, but nevertheless, the area does have consistent instrumentation. So I chose to use the electric piano as the orderly instrument for the area, with each of the 4 floors emphasizing like a different pitch range of the electric piano, the lowest floor being the lowest notes and then the highest floor being the highest notes. So I picked the piano for this area because it has such a wide octave range. And I also think piano doesn't really feel out of place for an art gallery. So for the exterior and all the floors except for the first floor, the chaotic instrument is the classical guitar. The first floor of the gallery, though, has puzzles that reference other parts of the game world, so the chaotic instruments there are taken from those other areas and then mixed in with the piano. So unlike in some parts of the game where we would have done individual music zones for individual puzzles, centered on that pressure plate and mixing in the different chaotic instrument tracks, depending on which mechanics were in that individual puzzle. In the art gallery, there's just a single mix for the whole floor. The reason for that is because a big part of the challenge for the floor is that the first time you come in this area, you may not even know what you're looking at all. And having a single mix of that music for the whole floor means that players aren't going to be like noticing that the music changed as they like moved around to this puzzle and start thinking that like the music is somehow an important clue to these puzzles, because they're not music puzzles.
Some puzzles in the game use a different interface. Instead of toggling tiles on a grid, you trace a path on the floor. Some people call those snake puzzles. When you're standing on one of them, a track called Snake Dance is added to the mix. It contains finger snaps and brushes on a snare drum. I left the floor puzzle, so the Snake Dance track is now fading out. In the game, there are 4 types of meta-puzzle mechanics: building bridges through water, rotating bridges in the gardens, moving platforms in the mine, and rotating platforms in the mill. The meta puzzles are a special part of the game and perhaps they deserve some kind of representation within the music. So I wanted to add an instrument or some kind of music layer for each meta puzzle mechanic. But when I pitched this idea to Matthew, he was like, please let's not do this, we don't have time for this. So that was like 4 weeks before the release, and there were still a bunch of more important things to do in terms of music, so we didn't do it. In retrospect, maybe we should have tried adding those shortly after the release. It would have introduced even more variety and richness into the music. Some puzzles in the game have tiles which you cannot toggle, they are forced. There is also no instrument tied to that mechanic. Game's core mechanics, like the main puzzle interface, walking or colliding, also aren't tied to any instruments. The goal was to musically highlight the differences and connections between different parts of the game, not to obsessively assign an instrument to every mechanic. In a game with a large set of mechanics that interact with each other in many different combinations, implementing the mechanic equals instrument idea can be challenging. In Taiji it was easy because for most of the game, the puzzle mechanics associated with different areas aren't mixed, and when they are, it's always the same 5 mechanics. Story-driven games and movies focus on characters instead of mechanics, so for them it makes sense to assign instruments to the characters. Stray Gods is a visual novel that does this. Athena is tied to the same instrument as the Furies, in order to highlight their connection. The main composer for Stray Gods, Wintory, has published several videos on his YouTube channel explaining the game's music. I put a link in the description to the one that talks the most about the instrumental associations of the characters. In some games you can switch between characters. You could tie an instrument to each character, and when you switch the character, you also switch the instrument. This is a good idea, particularly if characters differ in their abilities. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any game that implements this, but to illustrate the idea, I'll overlay my own music over a sliding Sokoban game where you switch characters. The vibraphone is tied to the blue penguin, and the upright bass to the red penguin. The instrument of the currently controlled penguin will play louder than that of the inactive penguin. It makes more sense to subdue the inactive penguin's instrument instead of muting it, because the inactive penguin is still part of the puzzle. Besides, the musical transition is smoother and therefore less distracting to the player if you subdue the inactive character's instrument than if you mute it. You could also do this in a co-op game where you control multiple characters at once. I don't know of any actual examples either, so again I'll overlay my own music over a game. When a character moves, its instrument is loud, otherwise it is quiet. So when the water girl moves, the harp is loud, when the fireboy moves, the saxophone is loud, and when both move, both instruments are loud. Some of you might ask, wouldn't combining the melodies from different pieces in the Taiji mashup piece make the music sound dissonant? And the answer is no, because all of the music in the game, except for the music for the endgame area, the endings and the credits, is composed just out of 5 notes, the notes of the D minor pentatonic scale. By saying that it's composed out of 5 notes, I meant 5 notes per octave. Across 7 octaves, that makes 35 notes. None of those notes are dissonant with each other, which gave us a lot of freedom to mix music from different areas. In the mixing areas, along with the mashup layers, we also blend pads from both areas whose mechanics are combined. We do the same with pads in the music zones between areas. In the white ending puzzle room, we mix pads from all major areas. When you're standing on a pressure plate, the instruments from its corresponding area play. If we did the same thing and the music for different areas would be composed in a bunch of different scales, in most cases the result would be extremely dissonant. The endgame area is divided into 5 sections. The side sections reference the game's 4 major symbol areas, and they use the instruments from the areas they're referencing. The endgame area uses full D minor scale, which has the same notes as D minor pentatonic scale, and 2 additional notes, which make the endgame area music more dissonant than the music in the rest of the game. But the music from all other areas in the game is harmonically compatible with the endgame area music. This allowed us to reuse the orderly instrument tracks and pad layers from the major areas in their corresponding side sections of the endgame area. Another game that is almost entirely scored in one scale is Cyberpunk 2077. Take a listen to those excerpts from the interview Austin Wintory conducted with the composer for Cyberpunk, Marcin Przybyłowicz.
All of the music in-game, excluding the songs, is in one key. So it's all A minor. So that means...
The whole score of the entire game.
The whole score is in one key, yeah. So that means whenever we are experiencing, for example, tracks overlapping in a way we haven't planned. So, for example, you have this really underscore-ish pad-based exploration cues playing around, and suddenly you enter some restricted area, and combat cue is slapping you in the face. Even if we do not plan the system to work itself out intelligently, it would still sound okay because of the same key signature. So maybe it's a lazy approach, but it actually worked, it saved our assets. Yeah,
I was going to say it's hard to call it lazy when you have this task of figuring out a way to make 8 hours worth of musical systems that are near impossible to predict every possible permutation of. It's a system that becomes so complicated that some parameter at your disposal must be simplified in order to help make it more palatable. Because violent crossfades between cues that have nothing to do with each other. That's what has defined games for the last 30 years, and it's one of the things that especially even growing up, I always hated. Where I thought, if I can ever work in games, that's one of my quests to try to fix, is that interactive systems can actually...
Yeah, to make it more elegant, right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, and that kind of solution is certainly going to go a long way. And I'll give you, and to your credit, listening through the soundtrack album, I don't have perfect pitch, so I didn't spot this, but it does not come across as though every single piece is in the same key. And normally, if something where you feel it, you just feel like this is all sort of stuck in the same place, but it doesn't actually come across that way at all.
When I started working on the music for Trifoil, Andrew told me that he doesn't want any dynamic music. He just wants a single loopable track per area. Therefore, the main reasons for sticking to the same scale throughout the game didn't apply, so I chose to score Trifoil in multiple scales, which allowed for more variety in terms of mood between different areas. Each area has its own scale. However, scales of associated areas are closely related. The free-floating symbol areas are follow-ups of the non-free-floating versions. It's the same mechanic, but approached from a different angle. I wanted to reflect this continuity through harmony, so I made the scales used in the two bridges areas differ by only one note. The same goes for the scales used in both twists areas. In both cases, changing this one note makes the music in free-floating symbol areas more dissonant. In Trifoil, I tried to link the puzzle difficulty to music's mood. Harder areas have more dissonant music than easier ones, although it's not very noticeable in the Trifoil demo, since some puzzles were cut to shorten it. I'm not sure if this idea will be incorporated in the final version of the game, because the difficulties of certain areas might change, and keeping this idea is not a good enough reason to recompose those areas' music. I created sound effects after I already composed several music pieces for the game, and I decided to make most of the sound effects be in the same key as the music. Since different areas are in different keys, I had to create a lot more variations of the sound effects than if everything were in the same key. Mini Metro is a minimalist strategy game where you design and manage an expanding subway system. Gameplay elements and events such as subway lines, moving trains, and spawning passengers trigger sound effects that act as musical notes or percussion. When you start the game, there is no music. When I place the first subway line, you will hear a quiet synth that represents it, along with sound effects triggered by gameplay events. The music that those sound effects produce becomes increasingly denser as the subway network grows, giving the player a strong sense of progress. In the 2D platformer Celeste, during the section where you clean up Mr. Oshiro's mess, the music changes instrumentation as you reach certain milestones, reflecting your progress and building tension. It begins with piano and soft percussion. On reaching the first milestone, theremin, synth, and more percussion are added in. On the second milestone, theremin is replaced by a heavy synth. And the last milestone reintroduces theremin. Instead of adding in a layer to the mix at full volume when a player reaches a milestone, you could gradually increase the volume of certain musical layers as the player progresses through the area. The clip I'm going to show you in a moment is from the development build of Trifoil. This doesn't work in the demo. Before, the music in this area was just a single looping audio file. Recently, I separated this music piece into 3 layers. The bass music layer always plays at full volume and includes the pads as well as the reverb for the electric guitars. Now I'll show you how each layer sounds in isolation. Layer 1 contains dry electric guitar arpeggios, and layer 2 contains dry electric guitar lead melody. By dry, I mean that they have no reverb applied to them. The reverb for the electric guitars is already inside the bass music layer. Let me show you how the lead melody layer sounds at different dB values. 0 dB is full volume, as if you applied no volume changes to the audio file. If a layer is at -12 dB, it means it's 12 decibels quieter than full volume. When no puzzles in this area are solved, both layer 1 and 2 are very quiet. When I solve a puzzle, the destination volume is going to increase, and the actual volume of a layer is going to gradually change towards the destination volume. The destination volumes depend on the number of puzzles you've solved in this area. The values are specified in this text file. The value on the left is the number of puzzles you solved in this area. The value in the middle is the destination volume of layer 1, and the value on the right is the destination volume of layer 2. So when no puzzles are solved, the destination volume for layer 1 is -7 dB, and for layer 2 it's -12 dB. The base layer always plays at full volume. When 3 puzzles are solved, the destination volume for layer 1 is -3 dB, and for layer 2 it's -7 dB. Right now, 1 puzzle is solved, so the destination volumes will be a third of the way between those values. Now I'll solve a few more puzzles. Notice how the dry electric guitar layers gradually get louder, making the music less ambient as you approach the end of the area. There are 2 puzzles left to complete the area, but solving the next one won't make any layer louder, since both layers already reached their maximum volume. So the player will hear the final mix while solving the last 2 puzzles. The mix changes very gradually, so it's hard for the player to consciously perceive that we dynamically change the mix, which is what we wanted. And since you're not as familiar with this music piece as I am, You also might have trouble hearing those changes from the footage I just showed you. So now I'll play the same fragment of music multiple times with different numbers of puzzles solved, so you can actually hear the difference. Notice that the electric guitar doesn't just get louder. Since the dry guitar signal becomes louder in relation to its reverb, the guitar also becomes clearer. It comes into focus. I think it feels appropriate that the music becomes more intense as the difficulty of the puzzles rises. Another reasoning behind it is that an instrument growing louder mirrors your growing understanding of the mechanic it represents. After finishing the bridges area, you unlock a new area that elaborates on the bridges symbols by connecting them with the free-floating symbols mechanic. At the start of this area, the electric guitar layer is already near full volume, because at that point the player already has a good understanding of the bridges symbols. This area is like a part 2 of the bridges area. This continuity between the areas is reinforced by the electric guitar's volume staying high from the end of the bridges area into the beginning of this one. The bridges symbols feel a bit different when combined with the free-floating symbols mechanic, which justifies why electric guitar starts near full volume and not exactly at full volume. Another reason is that it adds a bit more variety to the mix throughout the area. But the cello, which represents the free-floating symbols mechanic, starts quietly. The cello growing louder, along with the electric guitar growing slightly louder throughout this area, mirrors your growing understanding of how those two mechanics interact. One major benefit of changing mix throughout an area is that it makes the music loop seem much longer than it actually is, which allows you to get away with having a shorter music loop without the player getting tired of listening to it. Implementing this dynamic music system, separating music pieces into layers, and specifying volumes in a text file is much cheaper than making the music loop for each area significantly longer. So this is a smart way of driving the overall development cost down. We can also use this dynamic music system for subduing music in the pause menu. That's what the first row in the text file is for. It specifies what the volumes of the layers are in the pause menu. In this case, layer 1 and 2 are practically muted. In Taiji, the mix also gradually evolves as you move through a major area, but it depends entirely on the music zone you're in, not on how many puzzles you've solved. Besides, in Taiji we couldn't focus just on making the mix reflect the player's progress, as it also needed to match the mood of a given location within the area. For instance, when you're inside a dark cave, the music is darker and more subdued than in the open air. The music in the central section of Taiji's Endgame area reflects your progress through the area. When none of the area's side sections are completed, the music in the central section consists only of vocal pads. Now I'll complete the mill section. After doing that, when I go back to the central section, you can see that the bass guitar, which is the orderly instrument from mill, was added to the mix. Each time you complete a side section, an instrument from it is added to the central section. By the end, the central section features one instrument from each side section. Since the central section music piece is called Taiji on the soundtrack album, I wanted it to strongly reflect dualism. The vocal parts consist of both male and female voice samples. Male voices are panned right, female voices left. This is because the feminine and left side are associated with yin, while the masculine and right side are linked to yang. Furthermore, the piece uses two orderly and two chaotic instruments from the side sections, so the balance between order and chaos is maintained. The orderly instruments are panned right and chaotic ones left. In the wide ending puzzle room, when no puzzles are solved, pads from all areas play simultaneously. Solving a puzzle removes the corresponding area's pads from the mix. So you can see that the pads from Mill, Gardens and Orchard are now muted. Standing on a pressure plate from a given area triggers the melodic instruments from that area, but that's totally independent of what happens to the pads. All the puzzles in this room are now solved, therefore all the pads are muted. So it's the same idea as in the central section of the Endgame area, except here we subtract the layers from the mix instead of adding them. This is because completing the Endgame area leads to the black chaotic ending, while solving those puzzles unlocks the white orderly ending. Since the endings are opposites, the mix evolves in opposite ways as you approach them. When you first enter the white ending room, all pads playing at once sound chaotic, but as you get closer to the orderly ending, the music moves toward perfect sonic order. I chose to focus on pads in this room because it contains environmental puzzles, and I felt the pads represent the environment and the environmental puzzles in the music. You could use this idea in the context of combat. The music would be split into multiple layers, and there would be an algorithm that calculates their volume based on the combined danger level of enemies you're fighting against. The pads always play, even outside of combat. Other layers will fade in when enemies appear. A goblin adds one volume unit. With one goblin, the first layer plays quietly. With two, it reaches full volume. Let's say that an orc is 2 times stronger than a goblin. Therefore, it adds 2 volume units, so shakuhachi and horn layer will now play at full volume. The last layer will gradually fade in as I add more goblins. As I defeat enemies, the layers will fade out, reducing intensity of the music and reflecting my progress, just like how the pads layers are removed in the white ending puzzle room. This is a good example of music reflecting difficulty. The more intense the music, the higher the difficulty. If you're interested in dynamic combat music, you can watch Austin Wintory's video on the combat music system in Towerborn, which is similar to my Goblins example but implemented differently. The link is in the description. At the center of Taiji's world, there is this circular progress tracker, which contains 9 symbols. Each of them represents one of the major areas. The piano plays melodies taken from all areas in the order their symbols appear on the progress tracker moving clockwise, with piano chords separating each melody. When an area is completed, its orderly instrument doubles the piano melody, and the pads from that area are subtly added to the mix. Here's how it sounds with 5 completed areas. When the time is reversed in a video game, it makes sense to mirror this by playing audio in reverse. A great example of this is Braid. It's a 2D puzzle platformer in which you can rewind time. As you rewind time, the music and sound effects play backwards. The game is split into several worlds, each focused on a different time-related idea. In one world, time flows backward by default for everything except the player, so the music plays in reverse by default. In this case, rewinding causes time to move forward for everything but the player, making the music play normally. Few games feature a continuous time rewind mechanic, but a lot of puzzle games have an undo feature, which is just a discrete rewind. Reversing music when you undo usually wouldn't make sense, but you can make the sound effects play backward. In Trifoil, undoing movement plays reversed movement sound effects with a lot of added reverb. Same for undoing puzzle reset. Placement of a symbol. as well as shrinking and enlarging. Patrick's Parabox does the same thing, but only for movement and box pushing sounds. Undoing a reset just plays the regular reset sound. Undoing other actions like entering and exiting boxes doesn't play any sounds. When you undo in Fidel Dungeon Rescue, usually only the reversed movement sound is played. Resetting a puzzle is another kind of discrete rewind. In the Talos principle, it is accompanied by a tape rewind sound. Besides time, other gameplay elements can be reversed too, which also can be reflected by using reversed audio, which is what we did in Taiji's Endgame area. In a regular Taiji puzzle, you can toggle the tiles while the positions of symbols are fixed. In the Endgame area it's reversed. You can move the symbols, but you can't toggle any tiles. So the roles of the tiles and symbols are reversed in terms of what player can interact with, while the rules of the symbols stay the same. To reflect this, I made one side of the music play in reverse, while the other plays normally. When the speed of time changes, it makes sense to adjust the audio speed or music tempo accordingly. Increasing the rewind speed in Braid also makes the audio rewind more quickly. You can change the rewind speed to 0, which stops the music and plays only a quiet, low-frequency noise. If you don't let go of the rewind button, you can do the opposite of rewind, until the point in time in which you started rewinding. You can speed up the reverse rewind too, which will make the audio play faster. Instead of literally changing the audio playback speed, you could mirror changing the simulation speed by adjusting the music tempo as in Minimetra. Right now the simulation is paused, so only the ambient sounds that represent subway lines are playing. Those will keep playing at the same speed regardless of the simulation speed. When I unpause, gameplay event sound effects are going to play. And if I speed up the simulation, the tempo of the music that the sound effects create will get faster too. In one of the worlds in Braid, you can drop a ring. The closer something is to the ring, the slower time flows for it. Music speed is determined by the player's distance from the ring. While the speed of a sound effect depends on how close its source is to the ring. In World 4 of Braid, the time is tied to the player's X coordinate. Moving right advances time and music, while moving left rewinds time for everything except the player and makes music play in reverse. Superhot, a first-person shooter in which time moves only when you do, does the same thing with audio as Braid's World 4, but only with sound effects, since it doesn't have any music. Typically, in action games, music is more intense during combat than outside of it. The same idea can be applied to puzzle games. When you exit an area in Taiji, usually you have to traverse a bit of space that contains no puzzles to get to the next area. This gives the player a chance to relax and recharge mental energy after solving puzzles. The music complements that by becoming much more laid back. That's also the case in Patrick's Parabox. After completing a puzzle sequence, the game returns you to the hub, where you can choose your next puzzle. While you're in the hub, you're resting from solving puzzles, so the music becomes sparser or quieter. This is implemented differently in each area, but in most areas, the lead melody plays only in puzzles and is muted in the hub. In some areas, the whole mix is quieter in the hub. The cycle area, along with muting the lead instrument in the hub, also mutes the pads. The puzzle game Storyteller does a more extreme version of that. This is how the music sounds in one of the puzzles. Now I'll exit the puzzle. As you can hear, music in the level selection screen is much more ambient than in the puzzles. Another benefit of making the level selection music very ambient is that it makes the transitions between tracks smooth. You can also move to the next puzzle in the same chapter by pressing the right edge of the book. As you heard, in that case, the music abruptly crossfades between very different pieces, which is not always a bad thing. It can be an artistic choice. In this context, it feels fine to me. Games typically increase the music intensity as the action intensity rises, though it's an interesting approach to do the contrary for puzzle games, since overly intense music might interfere with thinking. A good example of that is Manifold Garden, where music is typically quiet and sometimes even silent during puzzles. The music becomes much louder outside of puzzles, pulling your mind out of the silent puzzle-solving focus. Many games include optional areas, levels, or puzzles. Often, it makes sense to highlight that they're optional by making their music distinct from the music in the mainline part of the game. Since these typically serve as a break from the mainline and tend to be less important, giving them more relaxed, more ambient, or simply quieter music can feel appropriate. In Patrick's Parabox, there are two types of optional puzzles: those with red borders and those with cyan borders. In the red border bonus puzzles, the music is quieter than in the mainline ones, and extra reverb is applied to the whole mix. In some areas, other changes are made to the mix of the red border puzzles as well. For example, in this area, the relative volumes of instruments are adjusted and a vibrato effect is added to some of them. The cyan border optional puzzles are more important than the red border optional puzzles. Even though the cyan border puzzles aren't part of the main line, you can think of them as an extension of the main line for players who enjoy tougher puzzles, so they use the same music mix as the mainline puzzles. Another reason for subduing the music in red border puzzles is that most areas use short rhythmic music loops, and listening to some of those over a long period of time can become tiring. Since red border puzzles are harder and therefore more time-consuming than mainline puzzles, subduing the mix on those might prevent players from going to another area or exiting the game just because they're tired of the music. In general, when making game music, you should think a lot about whether players might get tired of it.
Okay, I wanted to go back actually and do some of these extra levels. The only reason I went ahead here was because I was getting a little tired of the music. So I will say that's maybe my most criticism of the game right now, is the music. It gets a little tiring. It definitely says something negative about the music if I want to move on to another area because I'm tired of hearing the same very short music loop.
One design issue in Taiji is that it doesn't clearly communicate which areas are optional, and some people play through the optional areas thinking that they're not optional. A potential solution to this problem could have been to make the music in optional zones more subdued than the music that plays during mainline puzzles, just like in Patrick's Parabox. Unfortunately, we didn't do that because we didn't think of it at the time, Besides, some mainline zones also feature subdued music because it fits the mood of those locations and adds variety to the music if you're just following the main line. Because of this, even if we had made the optional area music more subdued, the contrast with mainline music wouldn't have been so strong, unless we made the music that plays during all mainline puzzles not subdued, but that wouldn't have been worth it. However, we implemented this by accident in the non-mixing parts of the bonus area, where the music is very sparse because it uses only one layer from the mashup piece. Most players solve the bonus area puzzles after reaching the first ending, so at that point they feel like they completed the main part of the game, and the sparse, soothing music gives them a feeling of a well-deserved vacation. Celeste contains bonus levels called B-sides. Making the music less intense for those wouldn't make sense, because Celeste is a difficult precision platformer, and the B-side levels are harder than the main levels, therefore they feature more intense music than the music for the main levels. Furthermore, each B-side track is a remix of a main level track, and each was created by a different composer. Only one of them was made by Lena Raine, who scored all the main levels. So naturally, the B-side tracks feel very different from the main level tracks. Opening the pause menu is a literal break in the gameplay, so it should feel like it. When you enter the pause menu in Ori and the Blind Forest, the music becomes quiet. It works the same way for opening the map and the skill tree, which also pause the game. When you open the pause menu in Braid, the music gets muted. In Patrick's Parabox, a different music piece starts playing. In Shogun Showdown, the music is run through a low-pass filter. In Taiji, the pad layers keep playing at the same volume while all the other layers become very quiet. In Fidel Dungeon Rescue, the music doesn't change when you open the pause menu, which doesn't feel good. For most of the game, it's not that terrible because it's a turn-based game, so nothing happens without you making a move. However, the game contains a time challenge mode in which a ghost chases you, accompanied by intense music. When you pause the game, the intense music keeps playing, which might feel like the ghost keeps chasing you while the game is paused, even though it is not. The only games in which keeping the same music playing after you enter the pause menu makes sense are the ones in which simulation doesn't stop on entering the pause menu, mostly multiplayer games. Subduing music in the pause menu makes it harder to adjust audio volumes in the settings, but you can simply make the music play normally while the player is in the audio settings, Braid handles this well. Hovering over the music or sound volume sliders plays both music and sound effects, making it easy to balance them. Hovering over the commentary volume slider plays a commentary and switches audio to commentary mode.
So that leads to compact designs, number of rooms and whatever.
Right.
Decided early on, Braid's a puzzle game. It's not an action game.
Right.
as you just said.
In Celeste, the music in the pause menu is run through a low-pass filter as well as lowered in volume, but when you hover over the audio settings, it plays as if you were outside the pause menu. Another example of a break in the gameplay is when the game window loses focus, for instance when you Alt-Tab out. In this case, some games mute the audio, while others keep it playing. Muting makes it feel like you're taking a break from the game and prevents the game's audio from interfering with what you're doing outside of it. It is an especially good choice for an action game in which the game is automatically paused when the game window loses focus, because hearing intense music after you Alt-Tab out would make it feel like the game is not paused. Besides, intense music could severely interfere with whatever you're doing outside the game. Another reasonable option in this case could be switching to pause menu music, depending on how the pause menu music is implemented. For many puzzle games, it's better to keep audio playing when the window loses focus, because some players will take a screenshot of a puzzle to solve it in a drawing program. They're still playing the game, even though it's through a drawing program, so the game audio should keep playing. When Taiji launched, the audio was muted when the window lost focus. Several months after the release, Matthew watched a streamer playing Taiji and solving the puzzles in a drawing program. The streamer got annoyed by the music cutting out every time he Alt-Tabbed out to the drawing program, so he muted the in-game music and played the Taiji soundtrack through YouTube instead, which is very bad. Soon after, Matthew added a setting to choose whether audio mutes when the window loses focus. We did a poll on Taiji Discord server to determine what the default setting should be, and 72% of voters preferred the audio to keep playing. The vast majority of games don't have this setting, which is a problem. In my opinion, it should be the standard. Some games even have mods that mute the audio when the window loses focus. You could say, well, if you're one of the few people who want this setting, you could just run a program that mutes other programs when they lose focus. Yeah, sure, but what about games that already mute the music when the window loses focus and you want them not to? Should only those games have the setting? And for the others you'd need an external program? I think that all serious games that feature music and don't automatically pause on losing focus should have this setting. That would solve the problem. Although it's more acceptable for a game to not have this setting if it mutes the music in the pause menu, because then if you want the music muted when you Alt-Tab out, you can just open the pause menu first. Another argument for not muting audio by default, if the game doesn't feature very intense music, is that it can be nice to listen to the game's music while doing whatever you Alt-Tabbed out for, especially when you Alt-Tab out only for a moment. Furthermore, some streamers need to Alt-Tab to check things for their stream, and they don't want the music to disruptively cut in and out when they do that. In this case, it's also nice to keep the game simulation running in the background, so that people who watch the stream can look at animations instead of a static image when the streamer Alt-Tabs out. In a game that doesn't automatically pause but mutes the audio when the window loses focus, a quick volume fade out on losing focus and fade in on regaining it would feel better than instantly muting and unmuting audio. That's what happens when you pause and unpause music on Spotify. This makes the transition smoother, but unfortunately few games do it on losing and regaining focus. You can strengthen the connection between music and gameplay by making the music mimic game mechanics, which can be achieved in many ways. One of them is using an audio effect reminiscent of that mechanic, for instance an echo effect. The mine area mechanic in Taiji is about pairing symbols. To solve a puzzle, each diamond must share a zone with exactly one other diamond of the same color. To reflect this idea musically, I used an echo effect configured to produce only one echo, so that every note is heard twice. The effect is applied to all music layers in the mine. As a result, the music consists of pairs of notes, just like a solved puzzle consists of pairs of symbols. In World 5 of Braid, your actions are recorded and, after you rewind time, replayed by a ghostly time clone of yourself. As the clone retraces your past actions, a music layer containing a subdued, shifted echo of the main track fades in, mirroring the ghost's timeline overlapping with the regular one. The reference area in Patrick's Parabox focuses on puzzles where boxes can exist within each other. For example, box 1 contains box 2, which can then contain box 1. To reflect this idea, the music uses an echo effect on the percussion motif. Later in the game, areas called Infinite Exit and Infinite Enter expand on this concept, and their music also uses an echo effect. In many areas of Patrick's Parabox, the music reflects the mechanic through mood or the choice of instruments. The most obvious example of this is from an area called Possess. In this area, the player can possess another box, which players can associate with ghosts or supernatural stuff. The music reinforces this association by featuring a hunting, theremin-like synth as one of the main instruments. For the next two areas, I'll play the music first and explain the connection afterward, so you can try to figure it out yourself. First, the empty area. The empty area has a lot of empty gaps in the music. now the eat area. To me, the eat area music feels quite childish. Since I know that the area is about eating boxes, this music makes me think of children in kindergarten eating a dessert. However, I know from the creator of this game, Patrick Traynor, that this music piece was supposed to feel like you were going to the kitchen to eat a midnight snack. The connection between the eat area's gameplay and music is tenuous. It's very probable that you didn't feel that the music evoked going to the kitchen for a midnight snack, even after I said that was the intention. So sometimes you won't be able to come up with strong reasons for deciding what the music for a given part of the game should be, but it's better to have a reason rather than none. Even if it's weak or dumb, most players can sense that there is a reason. Without it, the music will likely feel more random. The puzzles in the center area are about things being or not being at the center of an edge of a box. The music reflects this topic through panning. Both the lead synth and the high pulsating rhythmic synth wander between the left and right channels, occasionally landing in the center. The panning is subtle to avoid annoying or distracting players who are using headphones. On top of that, the center area music has a meditative vibe, and some people would say that meditation is about finding your center. Another way in which music can mimic a mechanic is through using a certain melodic idea reminiscent of that mechanic. The puzzles in the cycle area use a box inside box idea in order to set up loops of boxes. As you move boxes through the loop, eventually they will end up in their starting position. The music mirrors this concept by layering looping melodies, which I'll refer to as ostinatos. The most prominent ostinato in this piece is a two-note melody that repeats every 2 seconds. Underneath it, a soft synth plays an 8-note ostinato, although this melody sometimes changes a bit so that the music isn't overly monotonous. Occasionally, a wooden percussion instrument repeats a simple 3-note rhythmic pattern 8 times. Once in a while, a bell-sounding instrument plays the same melody twice. The flip area's music features a looping 3-note rhythmic pattern. The first note is panned slightly left, the second one is centered, and the last one is panned slightly right. So you hear the notes going from left to right, which reflects the horizontal flipping mechanic that this area focuses on. Additionally, the flipping mechanic is reflected through pitch, because the notes of the rhythmic pattern descend from highest to lowest. By the way, kudos to Priscilla Snow, the composer of Patrick's Parabox, for finding so many ways to reflect the gameplay in the music. The bridges symbol in Trifoil lets you cross lines and requires you to pass straight through the symbol without changing direction, so it's sort of like you're sliding through the symbol, which to me, as a guitar player, was reminiscent of guitar slides. That's why I chose electric guitar to represent the bridges symbol. A guitar slide looks and sounds like this. Or like that. You can do several slides in a row. In the lead melody, I don't use slides all the time, since that could be annoying or boring to listen to over long periods of time. Besides, most moves don't involve passing through the symbol. The guitar fretboard resembles a puzzle grid, so I thought maybe a single regular note is like moving by one tile, and as I mentioned before, the slides represent moving through a bridges symbol. So if you interpret it this way, then the lead melody reflects how you solve the puzzles. First you move several times, and then you pass through a bridges symbol, and then you move a bunch of times, and then you pass through a bridges symbol, and then you move again, and so on. By that logic, moving through a bridges symbol could also be represented as a 3-note arpeggio. So the first note represents the tile you're on before you enter the bridges symbol. Then the middle note, the second note, is when you move into the bridges symbol, and the third when you go on the other side of the symbol. So I did like an up and down arpeggio because you have to pass through each bridges symbol twice. And I also do the 3-note arpeggio in simplified form without slides. In the Junction area music, the lead and secondary vibraphones use 6 melodic patterns that mimic how the junction symbol works. When you enter the junction symbol, you can exit it in 2 ways. In this case, either by going up or down. In this secondary vibraphone melody, the first note represents the entrance to the symbol, and the next 2 notes played together represent the 2 exits you can choose. This short melodic pattern is repeated multiple times in a row. This melodic pattern recurs across the piece, but different notes are used each time. The second melodic pattern mimics the binary choice of the exit from the symbol. First I play the entrance note, followed by the exit A note, then there is a short pause, then I play the entrance note, followed by the exit B note. So the first half of the melodic pattern has an upward movement, and the second half downward movement. To me, this melodic pattern sounds like you can't decide which exit to take. Should I go up or down, up or down, up or down? I don't know. It's a tough choice. The third melodic pattern is played by the lead vibraphone. The first note represents the entrance. The next two notes are higher than the entrance note and create an upward movement representing going through exit A, while the remaining two notes are lower than the entrance note and create a downward movement representing going through exit B. I'll spare you the explanation of ideas 4, 5 and 6, and instead show you ideas 7 and 8, which aren't even in this piece yet. This is the unfinished version of the piece that we shipped in the Trifoil demo. I'll probably add ideas 7 and 8 to the final version. So the idea 7 mimics part of the mechanic I haven't explained yet. After leaving the junction symbol, you can re-enter it from the other side, which then allows you to retrace your line. Retracing a line could be mimicked by repeating the same melody, but when you play it the second time, it's an octave higher or lower, so it's as though you're retracing the melody. You can combine this idea with the melodic patterns, so you would have two ideas that mimic the mechanic layered on top of each other. Here I combined it with the melody featuring melodic patterns 3 and 5 that you heard in part a moment ago. Here is another version with a smaller gap between the initial phrase and its repetition. This version connects this idea with the melodic pattern 1. Retracing a line is the most unique thing about this mechanic, so I think I'll use the idea 7 a lot in the final version of this piece. The last idea connects well with the secondary melodies. Here I combined it with melodic pattern 2. The idea is to add panning within a single melody, so that the entrance note is centered, the right exit note is panned right, and the left exit note left. The panning has to be subtle so as not to distract players who are using headphones, but here I made it less subtle so you can hear it more clearly. You shouldn't pack too many ideas into one piece, because then it would become unfocused. In Trifoil I structured the music pieces so that the secondary instruments repeat the same 2 or 3 melodic patterns over and over, which holds the piece together, giving space for the lead melody to use more ideas and provide variety. I'll put a link in the description to an unlisted video in which this music piece is played from start to finish in the DAW, with the same overlay as here, just in case someone wants to hear how those melodic patterns are reused throughout the whole piece. There is a similar logic behind the melody patterns that the twist cymbal instrument uses, but I won't bore you with that, you get the idea. And besides, you probably already think that I am a lunatic for putting in the music ideas that almost no one will notice or appreciate. Unless I make a video essay in which I explain them.
And he's explaining to them what they should be listening for. Never explain your music. No. If you have to talk,
explain,
music,
you're losing.
Yeah.
Anyhow, if you're using the instrument equals mechanic idea, and you tie certain melodic patterns or effects to certain instruments, that extends the instrument equals mechanic into instrument plus melodic pattern or effect equals mechanic, hopefully strengthening the connection between a mechanic and the music associated with it in the player's mind. You might recall that in Taiji's mashup piece we reuse melodies from the major areas instead of writing new ones. Adding the specific melodies to the equation would make the association between mechanics and their music in the player's brain even stronger. Sometimes insisting on complete consistency in terms of conceptual ideas can make the music sound worse. Since sounding good is pretty important, often the right decision is to compromise the conceptual integrity. I already mentioned that in some areas in Taiji, we use 3 melodic instruments instead of 2 to make the music sound better, which weakens the musical reflection of dualism. In the gate music, the ruins and mill piano melodies are missing. This is because the original version of this piece was composed before those areas had been scored, and although they were filled in later, Matthew preferred the sound of the unfinished version. He told me that it was his favorite piece I composed for the game. I didn't think it sounded that good, and I thought that most of its value lied in the concept. But in the end, I decided to trust Matthew's judgment and let go of the conceptual perfection. Furthermore, Matthew simplified the graveyard and plateaus piano melodies, as he felt the original melodies didn't sound good in this context. However, once you complete those areas, the piano is doubled by their orderly instruments, which play the full original melody. The tutorial area features the black and white puzzles, so in theory the wind chimes should play there. However, having the music at the start of the game didn't feel right. The starting location should evoke the sense of an abandoned place untouched for 10,000 years, so you can only hear the wind there. Very quiet paths and wind chimes are introduced only at the end of the tutorial area. Another reason for holding back the music was to make leaving the tutorial area feel more impactful. Anyhow, it's better for those ideas to be a bit inconsistent than if they weren't there at all. Some of the ideas I discussed in this video are subtle and easily overlooked, and most players won't notice them consciously. So is it worth it to put them in the game? Nowadays there are countless good games available, and players only have the time to play a few of them, so they tend to choose the best and most polished ones. While in most cases these music ideas will not dramatically improve your game, they can add an extra layer of depth to it, which will subtly push it toward becoming a more holistic work of art, which might help it stand out among all of these other good games. I believe game developers should make fewer games and redirect their resources toward making every single game better. They should aim at creating masterpieces rather than just good games. Few of them will succeed at making a masterpiece. But either way, I think that aiming at greatness will lead to better results than simply aiming to make something good. If you want your game to feature an original soundtrack rather than licensed music, applying these concepts can be rather inexpensive, assuming that the composer understands the game well and is interested in exploring them. In fact, using dynamic music techniques can even lower the overall cost of creating and implementing the soundtrack. Imposing conceptual ideas on the music creates limitations in terms of what music you're able to compose. However, limitations spark creativity, pushing the music in directions you wouldn't go in otherwise, which might lead to musically interesting results. I put links to some interesting videos which cover similar topics to this video in the description. If this video was useful to you, consider supporting me by purchasing the Taiji Soundtrack Album, which includes a PDF where Matthew and I describe the making of Taiji's music in greater detail. You can also support me through Ko-fi. Donations will help fund my music-based puzzle game, which I plan to announce in the coming months. Thank you for watching, and I will see you around, everyone. Bye bye.
The piece you're hearing now is called Reflection on the Soundtrack Album. In the game, it plays near the Reflection Lake, where there is only one puzzle. Matthew described this puzzle as a fusion of orchard and gallery, so the piece mixes instruments from both areas. It also uses piano because the Reflection Lake is in between areas, and we use piano in between it.
Never explain your music.
Hier lag een rasrol van de juif, zelfs op zit, maar ze die gaan. Was laat nou in ons, er is er. Ik ben aan de scheld voor het ritueel.